Now, as for what is happening when it comes to the lockdown, as always, you know, this is the show every single night, 9 o'clock Eastern Eastern Standard Time. It's been a busy day. Can't blame it all on homeschooling, my fault. I'm just excited. It's my mate Betty's birthday. Anyway, the lockdown is going to go a whole lot longer than Friday. It's probably going to go for a couple of weeks, but I'll tell you in a second the data that's going to tell us that it looks like rather than being a Greater Sydney-wide problem, it really is going to start to narrow in on just a couple of local government areas, and that could lead to earlier freedom, but I don't want to give false hope. Here is the Premier talking in Sydney tonight.
I don't think it's helpful talking about scenarios at this stage, but what I have said very clearly is given where the numbers are, it's not likely, in fact, almost impossible for us to get out of lockdown on Friday. But we will be able to provide you further information as soon as that comes to hand. The length of the lockdown will depend on our ability to come together and to follow that advice across the state.
So as I've told everyone in Greater Sydney, and I get it, if you're watching me in somewhere other than Greater Sydney, it can be a little annoying to hear all this information, but just as it was in every other lockdown, I'm about facts first, I'm about hope over fear. So everyone knows who's in Greater Sydney that this thing's going to go for at least another couple of weeks, probably right off the entire month of July. But let's have a look at the numbers because they are an interesting story. Again, you won't see this on the news, you won't read it in the paper, you won't hear it on the radio. Make your mind up for yourself. 1.2 million people have been tested since the limo driver drove that limo through the health rules of the New South Wales government. Remember, never forget, I won't. This is their hotel quarantine. Of all the cases of 1.2 million people tested who were crook, knew someone who was crook, went somewhere where somebody was crook, or maybe just wanted a day off, 483 people have COVID. Good side, though, is when 1.2 million people are being tested, it works out as 0.03% of everyone tested as a result of what happened since about this time last month. Now, remember, we told you the question here is not just about those active cases, which right now across all of New South Wales, including hotel quarantine, is 766. The issues are mystery cases. So the ones where they don't know how they got it or maybe who they've passed it on to, that's 117. That's why the lockdown doesn't end on Friday. But if that number falls and falls quickly, that's when the light is there at the end of the tunnel. And don't believe me, you heard it from the Deputy Premier of New South Wales, who is part of the decision-making process. He's part of the emergency cabinet, and he told us that is the formula to look at when we spoke to him on this program last night.
That's the number we're looking at. If we're getting 100 cases and they're all in isolation because they've been close contacts picked up previously by contact tracers, we can live with that. That is exactly what we can live with. But it's the ones that are in the community that are of high concern, and that's all we're focused on.
So let's put this in perspective. 1.2 million people have been tested. 766 people have the virus. 117 people are the ones that are currently mystery cases. Well, it gets even tighter when you look at where those mystery cases are. They are not all over Sydney. Fairfield remains the issue with 62, and then its neighbouring local government area of Canterbury Bankstown, well, it's not even a third of that number at 18. Central Sydney is at 7, Waverley at 6. So the Sydney number and the Waverley number, they're going to drop very quickly. The Canterbury number, a little bit slower, and Fairfield, thankfully, it looks like, in terms of the extended lockdown, that what we're talking about here is that they probably will lift it for other parts of Sydney, certainly Greater Sydney, and start to focus in even harder on southwestern Sydney, where they made a decision today that anyone who is a worker who has to leave their house in Fairfield has to get a test every 3 days. This is to make sure that obviously that people don't get it before they know they've got it and don't pass it on unnecessarily. It's going to be arduous, but a 24-hour testing clinic has been set up in Fairfield. So, yes, there'll be big queues at the start and end of the day, but middle of the day, middle of the night, if you want to, you can get that test to make sure that you can keep leaving that local government area if you're a tradie or somebody else who, if you can, keeps working.
If you happen to have people on your work site, or you happen to have people overseeing work or any type of activity in your private residence or your commercial premises, please ask where they live. And if they live or come from that area or hotspot area, please ask when the last time was that they got tested. You will need to have regular COVID tests to demonstrate that you are COVID-free, even if you don't have symptoms, because unfortunately we see what we call asymptomatic people, people who don't have symptoms, are leaving the house, going out of that local area to work, and unfortunately sending the virus to other parts of Greater Sydney or elsewhere, and that's what we need to stop.
So again, it is a blunt instrument that is lockdown, but as the numbers go from this to this to this to this to this, and then hopefully they disappear in terms of the mystery cases, that's when it starts to go from the mallet to the scalpel. And yes, that local government area will continue to be a problem. But for those who write for the Turnbull Times or work in taxpayer media, this is of course not racist. Yes, Greater Western Sydney is a very diverse place, Fairfield in particular. But if that number of mystery cases was existing in the Premier's home suburb of Willoughby, well, exactly the same system would be in place, exactly the same one that I'm talking about. That said, the health hazard, well, he did nothing to help the situation today because, despite the fact that it is now the third week of lockdown, and depending on where you live, it could be even longer. People in the eastern suburbs, of course, were put into soft lockdown a little earlier than that. He still can't tell you who an essential worker is.
Will you define what is and isn't essential work, and can you send a message on what is essential and what isn't essential?
And what we've indicated is that to try and define that is very challenging. But I think in terms of essential work, the employer and the employee would know whether that particular worker was essential to the particular circumstances. And so it will be left to the worker and to the employer.
Feel free to give it a crack, Brad. I know it's difficult. I know you just want to sit there and yell at the media and yet again have no price to pay after Ruby Princess, but could you feel free just to pull out a piece of paper, talk to some business people. I know they don't work for government and they don't get a guaranteed pay rise like you and your mates do during this, but feel free to work out what the definition of an essential worker is. And again, why do I have a slightly more hopeful tone about me tonight? Well, we got some data today that came from Google. Don't ask me how they get it, but this might be an indication if you've got an Android phone or anything else, or you've been checking your Google Maps here, there and everywhere. But Sydney is slowing down. Now, this goes up until the 9th of July. But how's about this for a stop in movement? The heart of Sydney, which remember is the third highest location for mystery cases, 78% reduction in the number of people moving around, and those numbers come from 4 days ago. Waverley in the east, 61%. Fairfield needs to do a better job of it, but 48%, so half as many people moving around. And the northern beaches, slowing down, but they don't need to slow down with the same pace as a place like Fairfield does because there are still 0 cases there, despite the fact that, of course, you can't go to school. Penrith as well, no problems there. Campbelltown, no problems there, but a little bit of movement that if there is a problem, that will be one of the reasons why it would start to spike. So that's the ups and downs of what's happening in New South Wales right now. So it is still a speck at the end of the tunnel, but the light is there, and I'll point you in its direction each and every night.